President, today there are wildfires that are burning across the West. And I want to speak for a few moments about some very important work that Chair Mikulski and her colleagues have done on the Senate Appropriations Committee that is really built on a bipartisan proposal that Senator Crapo, our colleague from Idaho, and I, with a large group of bipartisan senators, are proposing to change the way in which forests are managed and reduce the likelihood of some of what I call these infernos, Mr. President. These are fires that are bigger, they're hotter, they're more damaging, and they act like a wrecking ball pounding at the rural West. And what has happened over the years is that the preventive efforts in the West in terms of our forests are underfunded. There isn't enough effort that goes to hazardous fuels management and thinning and programs that reduce the huge load on the forest floor. And I was just this past weekend both in Medford, Oregon, rural southern Oregon, and in Portland, meeting with the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. And they told me about the problem that Senator Crapo and I are trying to address in bipartisan legislation that Chair Mikulski has included in her appropriations bill. And the heart of the problem, Mr. President, is because these prevention efforts are underfunded. When it gets very dry and very hot, and particularly when there is a lightning strike or a series of lightning strikes, what you have is an enormous fire in a hurry. And all through the West, there's an effort to try to share resources, and communities work together and try to share efforts, aerial resources and others. But the reality is there's not enough money to put out those huge fires. So what happens then is the bureaucracy borrows from the prevention fund in order to put the fire out, and then we're on our way to two bigger problems, Mr. President. We're on our way to, again, a lack of preventive dollars because of this fire borrowing. Some of our colleagues call it fire robbery. I'm trying to be diplomatic. It's fire borrowing, I guess, if you want to be diplomatic. But we underfund prevention, and then, of course, we don't have the money needed for suppression as well. And this trend that I have described is getting more and more pronounced and more serious. So what Senator Crapo and I are proposing to do in order to make the focus on wildfire prevention is, in effect, say that the most serious fires in the West, the kind of fires that are dominating our TV screens night after night, 1% of those infernos ought to be treated like the major natural disasters they are and would be funded in the same way as other natural disasters such as floods and hurricanes. And specifically, the legislation that Senator Crapo and I and others are advancing would move any spending above 70% of the 10-year rolling average for fire suppression outside of the agency's baseline budget by making these additional costs eligible to be funded under a separate disaster account. Now, so far this year, more than 33,000 fires have burned a total of 1.6 million acres nationwide, and the numbers are growing by the minute. Just this past weekend, Mr. President, visiting with our wonderfully talented folks at the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management in Medford, they were telling me about their concern that in southern Oregon, where it's very hot and very dry and there can be lightning strikes, they were concerned about the prospect of another biscuit fire, which we had at the beginning of the century, burned 500,000 acres. Really our most destructive fire ever, and yet that was what was on the mind of the firefighting professionals when I visited with them in Medford Friday last. Now, this year, the administration already expects to exceed its firefighting budget by more than $600 million, and that isn't going to surprise anybody in the West. In 8 of the past 10 years, the Forest Service has spent more than its wildfire suppression budget, requiring the agency to engage in what I have just called fire borrowing to cover these wildfire suppression costs. And the reality is that in many cases, the borrowed monies are not repaid. In the cases where the funds are repaid, it's cut only through costly supplemental spending bills that Congress has to enact, or by taking money out of future years' budget. So what you have is this kind of borrowing that's extraordinarily disruptive to the ongoing work that the Forest Service and their contractors are in the middle of performing. And I might add, Mr. President, what all this does is it makes it more expensive in the future and makes it less likely that we're going to get the important prevention work that is so necessary. And in our part of the world, I think it's fair to say that Westerners are coming to consider the Forest Service, charged with managing the nation's forests for multiple uses and users, has really become something that more appropriately would be called the U.S. Fire Service, because in effect, that's what this agency is month after month using more of its resources on. What I was told in Portland last Friday, having visited rural Oregon on Friday and Portland on Saturday, the specialists in Portland on Saturday told me that the fire season is 70 days longer than it was until recently. So you've got this challenge of more fuel load built up on the forest floor, drier, lightning strikes, and lasting longer. And that is a prescription for trouble in the rural West, and in fact, that's what we are seeing. So my hope is that as a result of the work that Senator Crapo and I and others are seeking to do, is we can have more hazardous fuel treatments, more preventive work that will be effective at reducing fire risk and lowering costs. A fire in Central Oregon this year slowed to a halt when it reached treated areas outside the city of Bend. And I saw that, Mr. President, when I was in Bend looking at the difference between treated areas, this preventive kind of approach, and areas that were untreated. And a study published by Northern Arizona University's Ecological Restoration Institute concluded, and I'll quote here, treatments can reduce fire severity and successfully reduce fire risk to communities. Now, based on Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture analyses, 1% of wildland fires represents 30% of firefighting costs. That's what Senator Crapo and I want to address in our bill. What we're saying is for that 1%, the 1% that is really driving up, costs, let's handle those fires like what they are, which are natural disasters. And then instead of raiding the prevention money to put the fires out, we will be able to cause less problem in the future because we'll have the kind of preventive work that is so effective that I saw in Bend and elsewhere. So it seems to me, as we see in a lot of parts of government, there's a choice. You can spend modest sums up front on prevention in order to generate significant savings down the road. And if you've got $1 to spend, you ought to always try to put it in prevention and then make sure that of your scarce resources, to the greatest extent possible, you target the remaining money on those infernos that are bigger and hotter and more damaging and cost about 30% of the overall budget. So, in summary, Mr. President, the legislation that Senator Crapo and I and others are pursuing would fund the true catastrophic fire events under separate natural disaster programs. Routine wildland firefighting costs would be funded through the normal budget and appropriations process. Oversight hearings, letters, and numerous discussions with the administration and colleagues helped produce the approach that Chair Mikulski has included. I remember not long ago, Mr. President, being in Idaho, being hosted by our colleagues, Senator Crapo and Senator Risch. We had members from across the political spectrum. Congressman Labrador from the other body was there. We had progressive members. This is something that is common sense. This just makes sense to make sure that the small number of fires, these infernos, which are dominating our news accounts, let's handle them from the Natural Disaster Fund, and then let's put most of the money and allow the Forest Service and BLM professionals to put their focus and their resources where we can prevent as much of the problem here as possible and prevent it early on. That's the point of our legislation. We are very grateful to Chair Mikulski for her effort. I want to thank Senator Crapo for his support. He and I have been at this with Senator Risch and Senator Merkley and Senator Cantwell and Senator Murray, Senator Bennett, all of the Western senators. Senator Udall has been doing important work on this in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. All of the Western senators are of like mind here. And Chair Mikulski recognizing what we're looking at. And the prospect that we would be leaving this week without this change to make better use of our resources, I think is just, I call it legislative malpractice, because we have an opportunity in a bipartisan way to make a real difference here. And given what our colleagues are seeing, if they're outside the West, I'd say it's a chance to spend scarce dollars more effectively. And for us in the West, it's nothing short of survival. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.